For people who are unfamiliar with Iran, why don't you give us a quick crash course of history about Iran's Islamic Revolution? Because I think that's something that in a lot of coverage about Iran and West relations is always left out, the fact that Iran has been affected by imperialism. So give us a breakdown of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with most West Asian or South Asian nations, particularly colonialism plays a big part. And the British, of course, had a huge footprint in Iran. The Russians themselves played the great game, if you like, in that region. And I think the impact of those imperialistic machinations and the results of that have really created the modern day Iranian psyche to a great extent. Now, nobody talks about the genocides that happened in this period. For instance, British imperialism presided over a famine in Iran, which nobody knows about, in which millions of Iranians died. They did it at the same simultaneously or around the same period with the Indian subcontinent. The region of Bengal had over 11 million people died due to a famine. Churchill himself presided over the latter, basically deciding to divert grain to other regions of the empire, presumably the British military, etc. And as a result of depriving those regions of the granary and the storage of food and wheat, etc., it resulted in huge famines when, of course, weather didn't work in the favor of those regions. So these kinds of crimes against humanity, we talk about Adolf Hitler, and we are told to constantly look at the crimes of the Nazis, for instance, but very rarely will you look at crimes that were committed against folk in this region by British imperialism or American imperialism, for that matter. And I think Iran was definitely colored by this imperial footprint in that region. They did have a history of rebelling from a very early stage, and the ulama, the religious leaders, had a very frontline role. Sayyid Shirazi, I believe, in the early part of the 20th century, led the tobacco revolt. And that was one, if you like, sign that the Iranian people themselves had a great sense of their own national sovereignty, their independence, their pride in their own, if you like, culture, a civilization which stretches back thousands of years, long before arguably civilization in the West reached any kind of level that might be described as that. The Iranians were very much at the forefront of producing and time again producing men of science, men of logic, of rationality, engaging in culture. If you go back and just look at the splendor of the architecture, going back to whether it's Persepolis and before that, or you come into the Islamic architectural period, you still find unmatched, unrivaled products of real culture and civilization, Isfahan being just one example, but you could go across the whole of the Islamic Republic of Iran and find evidence for that richness of culture. Coming into the 20th century, of course, we saw the British try to prop up a monarchy. Reza Shah Pahlavi's father, initially, followed by his son, were both propped up by what I call Western imperialism, or Anglo-Zionist imperialism, perhaps even you could describe it as. And their purpose was to, as with the rest of West Asia, was to secure oil, secure resources, and to create the geopolitical hegemony in that region. The Iranians initially, of course, had misgivings, but the Shah was backed, presumably, by military and other means, and he did come to power. He ruled for several decades. His father and he ruled for a substantial period until 1979. During the period that he ruled, he imposed a hugely imperialistic order of his own, despotic, totalitarian, again, wealth gravitating towards a few at the top, and the people themselves neglected. And that, I think, ultimately was his major downfall. Within all of this period of, if you like, Western-backed oppression of the Iranian people. You had, again, the clerics playing a very prominent role, the foremost of which was Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, who spoke up openly and very vociferously, at the threat of his own life being taken many times. And eventually, in 1963, he was expelled, and he was finally thrown out of Iran and sent to Iraq, where Saddam Hussein, that very interesting character across the border from Iran, who actually, had a wily eye on Ayatollah Khomeini while he had his sojourn in Iraq. At this time, of course, the movement in Iran continued. The movement against the monarchy, the despotism, and Western imperialism was still alive and well, and was hugely underestimated. Again, it was a very broad movement of, the Tudeh party, the left, the middle classes, even the bazaris, the merchants themselves, the ulama, the scholars, the religious scholars. So there wasn't a small, movement against the Shah. It was building up very powerfully. It seems as though the Americans who were propping up the Shah underestimated the scale of this movement. They did quite significantly in 1974 give the Shah of Iran a slap on the wrist, because even the Shah of Iran, it seems, was beginning to get some delusions of grandeur with his link up with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and the 1974 Lahore Conference, in which the OPEC nations, the Islamic nations of the West Asia, all got together. The Shah of Iran was a prominent player in this, along with the Saudis, Shah Faisal, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and other Islamic or Muslim leaders, secular Muslim leaders, and they were pushing for a bigger piece of the pie, I think, in terms of what was coming out of their own nations. It backfired on them. Most of those chaps were either hanged, knocked off, assassinated. Khalid Islambuli and company, the Islamists knocked off Anwar Sadat. You had Gaddafi bombed by the Americans into place. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was hanged by General Zia. And this paved the way for the Americans to begin a far more boots on the ground effort to control that entire region and its resources. Prior to that, I think they played a slightly more subtle role, but it became more overt after this period. Here in the West, we saw that oil crisis led to schools being shut down. So it really practically impacted in the 1974, the winter of discontent overthrew the Labour Party here. So you can see the repercussions in the West for shutting down the oil at that time had huge consequences. It may be the reason why the Americans were, perhaps caught off guard, because perhaps their relations with the Shah of Iran and the others were not quite as strong as they had been. Either way, they seemed to let or somehow took their eye off the ball, some would say they perhaps even allowed it to happen. But there was this idea that a secular liberal emergence of governance in Iran might be an okay thing. But it was the likes of Bani Sadr and Mahdi Bazarjan, various other leaders of the opposition to the Shah of Iran, who were, I think, expected by the West to take charge of any new order after the Shah of Iran. And when Jimmy Carter didn't act really decisively, and the people of Iran acted very decisively for the overthrow of the Shah in 1979, it was quite clear that what was expected from the West was perhaps that liberals would take over the establishment of the reins of government. What actually happened was that the people chose Ayatollah Khomeini. They went for a traditional, spiritually orientated man who had put his life on the line for Iran against the Shah. And his rise to power over the next 10, 15 years is so pivotal in terms of not only the geopolitics of West Asia, but arguably the global geopolitics, that we are yet to see its full impact actually manifest. What we saw was a new system of governance, a new mindset, a new set of ideas emerging from a nation which has huge intelligence and is used to, in its own right, having run empires, if you like, for good or bad in the past. They have that ability in that region to influence not just politically, but socially, culturally, linguistically, in all sorts of manners. And I think we're just seeing the natural return of a people who have a huge creative, intellectual, and spiritual contribution that could be made to the world and to that region. Ayatollah Khomeini simply became the mechanism or the front man to open the floodgates. And now what we've got is an Iran which is challenging Zio-Western neoliberalism, imperialism, neoconservatism. It's at the front line of challenging all that I think is bad within Western, if you like, doctrinal, political, social, if you like, engineering. Not that everything in the West is bad, because clearly there are hugely great people in the West. There are great thinkers. There are great humanists. There are all sorts of people who are spiritually awakened as well. But it's the establishment that I'm talking about, which has essentially been hijacked by, I think, values, moral values, ethical values, which go against Judeo-Christian traditional values. They go against Islamic traditional values. I think they go against human civilizational values. And I'll give you an example. And this is where Iran comes in as perhaps a viable or very interesting alternative within the mix of the world. That if you are going to erode the status of motherhood, if you're going to confuse people about gender realities with fluidity, if you're going to launch on an expedition to militarize feminism to undermine men, if you're going to use economic and financial mechanisms, usury mechanisms, money lending mechanisms to subjugate and enslave the world and to increase the wealth gap between the rich and the poor, if this is your ideology, if this is what, as a Western neoliberal fraternity, that political impact you want to bring, if these are some of the goodies, then is it any surprise that some parts of the world are going to say no? And they will say, absolutely not. This goes against our fitra. And this is a concept in Islam and in the Muslim world, which even Muslims, many of them, have forgotten, that there is a balance to human living, human lifestyle. There's a limit also. And there is a good nature and a bad nature. There is morality, which is based on prophetic virtue ethics, something we've lived by and has brought civilization to the West and the East over the years. And I'm talking about now, by prophets, I'm talking about great sages, even like Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu of China, or whether you went to sort of I don't know, the Buddha of of India, etc. There are so many wise, sage-like, prophetic folk who all came up with the same virtue ethics, the same values, the same, and from Iranian or Islamic point of view, we say this comes from God. It comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is part of the package that we are invested in as the vicegerents on this planet. And we have a responsibility to look after environment, to look after human beings in a balanced way, to look after the animals, to look after everything, but with wisdom and with balance. Neoliberalism does not have that. And I'll pause there, because in this context, I think at the heart of Iran's movement, at the core of it, I'm not saying every Iranian necessarily totally believes it, there are a lot of neoliberal Iranians as well, but there is definitely a commitment at the core, whether it's Ayatollah Khamenei now, the rabbi, the leader, they are genuinely committed to rediscovering what this balance is and to rediscover human civilization on the basis of ethics and morality, which we're all familiar with, not the kind of nonsense confusion which is being unleashed by many of these money-orientated, greedy, pernicious neoliberal and other ideologies.